As I continued my conversation with Ms. Theo Wells, I asked her first how we can prepare ourselves for dealing with conflicts and defensiveness which occur in negotiations. In addition, she provides us with some steps and communication skills we can use to deal with conflict, specifically some tools to help us communicate non-defensively. Theo, how do you prepare yourself for entering into a negotiating situation where there's often, if not always, an element of conflict or tension involved?
Well, I like to think of it sort of like a few moments to get centered into your home base of some kind of inner calm, whatever that is for a person. I like to think of it as just sort of getting centered. Now, a lot of people seem to have trouble getting a picture of what getting centered is. And I suppose the best one I can bring to mind, do you remember that old cartoon that El Cap had going? I think was it the Schmoes or the Schmoos, something like that? You know, where it was like this sort of thing with a happy face on that had a heavy bottom. They even made a toy out of it.
Yes.
The kids used to love it because you could go pow and it would go zing, 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 and pretty soon it would come back and it would be centered. And it's that sense of, pardon me, but I do like to visualize these things because it kind of helps for me, at least to get pictures of what it's like on these very intangible processes. But I rather like that idea of the schmo and sort of, even if I get zapped here and there, I can somehow come back to a center place. For me, that center contains my personal values, my objectives, some of it I'd like to achieve. I get off center if I try to kill other people. Centering questions might be, how can we all gain something we want? What are my options? If I get zapped or if I go blank, I know I can buy some time.
Mm-hmm.
I know how to do that. We can talk about that in a minute. And maybe I need to say to myself, shut up and think. Regroup. Or what results do I want? Just ask these things. What results do I want? What are my options? Can I buy time? What are my ways of buying time? Going blank. Haha, hi blank. What do you know? You're here. I don't need you right now, but you are telling me I'm under pressure. And I need to recognize that. And so I need to pull back just a little bit, give myself a little space so that I can really handle this the way I'd like to. Those are some of the inner dialogues that I give myself as I'm approaching what seems to be a possibly threatening negotiating situation.
What are some methods for helping us get off the defensive?
Well, I suppose my favorite one is just buy time. A lot of people feel like they gotta do something quickly. Gotta get in there and act, make things move. And many times those are the situations when it may be far more productive in terms of the real results a person would like to have. It might just be smarter to buy time. Now, buy time, big deal, but what do you do with the time you have bought? And the purpose for buying time is to get your thoughts together, your objectives together, what results you'd like to have, and refocus, regroup, recenter, so that you come out of a place of strength, a place of knowing where you're coming from, in order to be most effective as you can at that moment, at least, to get the kinds of results you'd like. Now, lots of people know how to buy time, but they may not be consciously aware they know how to buy time. Usually when I ask people, what are the ways you know to buy time, we come up with these kinds of lists. Say nothing.
Say nothing.
Go to the bathroom. Or in somewhere or another, leave. Maybe, oh really? Or, would you repeat that, please? One of my favorites is, out of the psychiatric notebook called And if you want to add a particular emphasis, you comment, interesting. Now, all that is sort of putting a grunt in the middle of the dialogue that says, hey folks, I got dibs on my place here. I'm taking a few moments out while I regroup, and I will be back in due time and will reclaim my space. And it's sort of a nothing signal that in essence says that. And because buying time is simply that, in order to get the time to take those few moments, or maybe it's a few hours, whatever, that it takes for you to be in touch with your feelings, or if you have so many of them, you need to sort of work them through a little and get them down to size, and refocus, regroup, so that you can come back in from a position of strength within yourself, even if you don't happen to be in a position of strength within the external negotiations going on out in the middle of that table. If you know where you're coming from strength within yourself, in due time, you will have a strength position. Maybe not a winning one, but certainly a strength position, or could be a winner too, in the center of that table. To me, that's the key purpose for buying time. Now, you know, some people can sit around a negotiating table, and just as they are about to make their brilliant intervention, there they sit, and they've gone blank. Their teeth are rattling around in their head, and they're wondering what to say next, and this glorious blank, and they feel like fools. The typical reaction, you're nodding and shaking your head, and I'm wondering what's going on in you. What do you want to say?
Well, no, that's a feeling of uncomfortableness for most people when they go blank.
Well,
Can that
normally,
also be used to an advantage then?
Well, it can be, but what happens with so many people, when I ask people, what do you say to yourself when you go blank, when they're not in one? Almost universally, the first response is, stupido, dum-dum, or something of that kind. And, well, one of the, I do some crazy things sometimes, but the picture I have in my head is that here they are in this negotiating situation, their blank comes along, and here they are, blank, bleh, wondering what to do. And so they go all the way, I call it the cable car caper. They take the cable car all the way down around the turntable in order to come back to where they got on in order to step off the cable car to go across the street. Mainly, what they're doing is they beat themselves how stupid they are. They tell themselves all this stuff about what's wrong with themselves, that they're stupid, dumb, in order to, and then they get way to the end of that line, and then they have to tell themselves, well, maybe it isn't so bad after all. We got to get turned around in order to get back to where they began, in order to go from there to the next place, which is, okay, now that I have a blank, what do I do with that so I can get back into operation again? And that's really all we need to do. But I noticed that a great many people take that whole cable car trip around before they get back and find out that you can step off that thing and just walk across the street. Okay, so I went blank. I have a little dialogue I do with me when I go blank. It goes like this. Oh, hi, blank. How are you today? And blank doesn't usually answer. And I keep on with things like, I don't need you right now, except whenever you show up, I do suspect I must be under pressure. Now, I just soon you go away right now because I don't need you, but I'll keep an appointment with you later on. And it's very important to keep that appointment later on. But I have gotten my clue. Then there's sort of this thing. Have you ever seen those lamps where they have the light bulb, the switch that goes, you know, where you push it in one side and it comes out the other,
Sure.
and all that sort of thing.
Sure.
It's almost like when I go blank, it's like some invisible hand comes from behind me and boom, hits that button and turns out my light.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, here I am, no head, no intelligence, no, teeth in my mouth clanking around. And so what I sometimes do is put my elbow on the table and I visualize this light switch moving through my temples. And I sit with my other hand on my temple here like I'm, what I'm really doing inside is turning my light switch back on. But it looks like the thinker, Rodin's thinker. That stance. Put your elbow on the conference table and you look like you're thinking deep thoughts about this great important problem that's going on in this conference. All I'm doing is inside saying, hey, light, go on. And my inner dialogue with my blank. But pretty soon, because I'm not beating myself inside, but because I am saying, it's okay, blank, for you to be here, your timing's a little off, my light's coming back on, and what do you know, pretty soon it's on. You can call it any label you want, but I call it getting that self-fulfilling prophecy working back in my favor for me. And I like those odds because that self-fulfilling prophecy is elusive and powerful. Mm-hmm. And when I have it going in my rhythm, it works beautifully for me. And I like to connect with that kind of energy. So, it may sound crazy, but it works. If we can honor what is happening within ourselves, we have the richness of our own resources available. We don't have to put ourselves down. We don't have to say, oh, how dumb I am, or who are all those smart other people, and what's wrong with me that I'm not as smart, and of course they're going to win and I'm going to lose and all that jazz. But that centering that says, I don't know whether I'm going to win or lose. And right now it doesn't matter because what I'm in there on is how can we gain what we would like as persons, the task, the organization, and the objectives we all share. And we can hone in on that and we can make it happen. Now, in addition to this buying time business, there's quite a few other possibilities for getting off the defensive. And I guess for the moment, I'm assuming that many people feel a little bit defensive as they enter negotiating situations. Just kind of don't know what's going on or what might happen or who's got what pile of ammunition stashed where. But what we can really deal with is the interchange, what's going on right now. And as I say, we've dealt with the buy time. Now here's another possibility. Name the game, or maybe name the process. For example, somebody is putting you down. Oh, and incidentally, have you noticed that many, many times when you're on the defensive, it's because somebody is zapping you, in a sense, subtly, with a double message.
Yes.
You're getting some kind of maybe positive message on the surface, but hidden underneath someplace is a zapper. So some sort of a hidden message that counteracts that surface message, or, you sort of get a positive thing and you get hidden underneath a negative one. You know that feeling in your gut where it goes, and it feels like your insides are sort of jarring a little. Perhaps you can connect with that. That sort of thing is when you know in your gut that you have been delivered a double message, and that usually generates a defensive feeling. The reason we get on the defensive many times, that's assuming you're not already defensive about something else, is that you think at one level you're getting Oh, good strokes, warm fuzzies, feels good, nice things. But at a hidden, subtle level, there's something that comes in and you're not sure what it is. You may get the feeling of it, and that feeling level, along with the negative feeling level from underneath, along with that sort of positive, good stuff that was on the surface, doesn't quite match. And that contributes to that sense of defensiveness.
How do you deal with those double meanings, those double binds?
Well, beyond the buying time, one of the quickest ways is to name the process of the game if you can identify it. For example, I often have gotten the thing, being a woman, I've gotten a lot of stereotypes. You know, such things as, quote, and this is a direct quote out of a letter, "It has indeed been a pleasure to meet a woman," this after a lunch meeting on an interview situation, "who is deeply committed to a career and has also managed to retain her femininity." I have no question.
What are the double meanings?
Well, I have no question that the whole message was intended to be a positive one. That was the tone of the lunch. But what really comes through is, isn't it remarkable, you know, that this woman who still somehow or another, strangely enough, appears feminine and also has a rather good brain. How does one reconcile these things? Well, you know, if I hadn't reconciled them myself already, it could be quite a defensive creating situation, because obviously there must be something wrong with me if I am so competent. But what is so puzzling is that I am still somehow feminine, whatever that means. I could get on the defensive with that kind of comment, even though it was sincerely delivered and meant as a compliment. It's sort of like the old saw, "You think like a man," when you're a female. I don't know of any way of saying "you think like a woman" and have it be a compliment. That speaks for itself enough, I think. But naming the process of the game might be, for example, somebody delivers you a little double message like that. A response might be, that feels like a stereotype. But when you name the game or the process, you better shut up and leave it alone, so that the sender of that message can either leave alone, pick up, respond, whatever they wish to what you've said, or leave it hang in midair and nothing happens to it. But if I say anything more than, that feels like a stereotype, and I go on and explain, you know, there you go, doing your number again, blah, 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 then I'm on the defensive, and the other person, if they were trying a power play, I give them the win.
So by naming the game and avoiding to responding to that game to the opposing party or to the other party, you avoid getting hooked into a defensive pattern.
If they are in fact seeking to set up a win-lose game, and in my examples it's not clear whether or not they were, and in usual life situations it's usually not very clear, but it often does occur. If they are trying to set up a win-lose, if I do anything beyond reporting only, not expressing, not explaining, just report or name, if I do that only, then I do not take on any responsibility or necessarily any acceptance of what they have said. I simply comment that it has occurred. Then I can stay off the defensive and leave the responsibility in their hands for what they sent. And they can own, deny, whatever they do. That's their business. But I must be willing to leave it right there. If I have a big anger about it, want to do a fight, I can do that too, but then I will escalate. And I will ask for a win-lose game, and the odds are very high that I'll get it. And much the same thing operates in another way of handling those, which is reporting the feelings that are involved. And I personally don't recommend that anybody report their feelings unless their feelings are at a rather low level, because it's hard to report feelings if they happen to be running high. We usually end up expressing them rather than reporting them. You know, reporting the feelings might be like, I'll say that you've said something angry-making to me, and I might say, reporting the feelings would be, when you say that kind of thing, I get angry.
But it's hard to do that reporting without actually expressing the anger.
That reporting is possible only when the feelings are at a low key. Most people, when they get to the point of being really aware of their feelings, and this is because most of us have been conditioned to be out of touch with our feelings, but those, when you're aware of the feelings, many times they're rather running kind of high level, in which case it might be, God damn it, when you talk like that to me, I get mad, and don't you do that anymore. Now, I think that's a very good example of expressing feelings. That's quite different from reporting feelings, which would be, when you say things like that, I get angry, you see. And that ties into another way of staying off the defensive, which is to send back those feelings without adding to them. In my first example, I wasn't adding to them. In the second example, it was quite clearly, not only was I adding to them, but I was escalating the issue very rapidly, and very likely to incite another incendiary return response. If a person happens to be in any kind of a down position, whether it's because of their formal position in the organization, if it's because they happen to be female, or they happen to be minority, or they happen to be young, or they happen to be too old, or they happen to be slightly, I believe the delicate word is handicapped, or any of those other things that put you at a disadvantage compared to the obvious model. You are in at least one or more down positions. When you operate in a world that values or places some value on up-down, if you're coming from a down place or a multiple down place, your odds aren't very good of winning from your starting point. So if you buy into the win-lose definitions, which other people define, if you accept those, you already accept the definitions for your own losing. And this gets to another very key thing, which I'd like to mention. The power to define is the power to control. If we give the power to define the rules to those who are on the upside and don't challenge that in any way, we have given away very substantial chunks of power. If we negotiate the definition of the rules, we negotiate the control.
In addition to communications, another critical skill for negotiating for mutual gain or constructive compromises is problem solving. Problem solving is important for generating and evaluating creative alternatives to conflicting viewpoints and needs which occur in negotiations. One set of problem-solving steps and techniques is called lateral thinking, which increases our capabilities for breaking out of traps and blocks and to look at issues and conflicts in new and different ways. In the next interview, Ms. Nancy Spiro gives us a definition of lateral thinking and how it differs from our ordinary thought processes, and also several techniques of lateral thinking for generating creative ideas. Nancy is an attorney at the Los Angeles law firm of McDonald, Halstead, and Laybourne. She has had extensive experience in negotiating the resolution of complex business litigations. Nancy, one of the critical elements in negotiations is the ability to deal in conflict situations in a way that creates a problem-solving environment so that people can generate alternatives and come up with solutions which quite often can be to the mutual gain or at least to some satisfaction to both parties. Do you have some perspectives or some ideas on how to create a problem-solving environment and what types of skills are needed in problem-solving?
Well, Ed, in developing the course that I've been teaching on negotiation, I've come across some very exciting material by Edward de Bono on lateral thinking, which is his way of describing creative thinking or creative thought process. And he actually has come up with some very specific examples and specific techniques on how to develop it. But first I want to tell you what lateral thinking is. It sounds sort of like a magic phrase, but really what it is a thought process that we've all recognized in other people. And when we see this other person do it, we snap our finger and we say, why didn't I think of that? It's some really unique, inventive way of putting some information together that seems, by hindsight, to be so logical and so reasonable. And yet, we couldn't come up with it, and perhaps we might have been applying ourselves to the problem and not come up with it. The thing that's going on is lateral thinking. And lateral thinking is a way of generating new ideas and new ways of looking at things, breaking out of old ruts and old patterns, self-perpetuating patterns that we may be analyzing our problems in. These self-perpetuating patterns lead us to the self-perpetuating solutions, and lateral thinking is designed to break out of the patterns to get us to new inventive solutions. Our traditional way of thinking is logical thinking. We put A to B to C to D and come to E, or we add 1 and 2 and equal 3. This is very high probability thinking. We come out with a logical, reasonable answer a great portion of the time. Unfortunately, this high probability thinking has some very structured processes and structured systems, and it does not permit us to come into inventive systems and come to unusual kinds of solutions. So what de Bono proposes is that in conjunction with your logical thinking, in conjunction with your deductive and inductive reasoning, you should develop skills to think laterally. And I'll give you an example of some lateral thinking so that you understand what I'm talking about. Humor, very often, is an example of lateral thinking. Humor is a temporary switch in the arrangement of information which sort of shocks the senses and in a temporary way it amuses, and yet it doesn't have any use for the average person, and that's why I say it's temporary. For example, the standard joke about the little old lady from Pasadena with tennis shoes who drives the Ferrari and so forth and so on. The reason that's amusing to people is that you don't expect to put a little old lady in a Ferrari with tennis shoes. Insight is very analogous to humor. Insight, however, is not a temporary switch in information. It is a permanent switch in information. In other words, is an unusual combination of information which has some permanent use. I'll give you an example of insight. In Japan, about 10 years ago, the people who worked for the subway wanted to have a strike. They were dissatisfied with their wages, and yet they knew that if they struck, they would lose the public sentiment, which had been on their side. People couldn't get to work, then the transit workers would no longer have their public support. So what could they do? Strike or not strike? Either way seemed to be a bad solution for them. The insightful solution, Ed, was what they ended up doing. They ran the train so people got to work, but they did not collect any fares.
Did it work?
It
Nancy?
worked. It worked. And as you can see, the insight is that they were putting pressure to bear on each of the groups that they wanted to along their own choice. Now, I don't know if I would have been able to come up with that solution. That is an insightful solution. That is the use of lateral thinking, an unusual combination or provocative arrangement of information. And I have 5 techniques that I'd like to share with you today, which can help people develop their lateral thinking skills. Now, when you find yourself with a problem, I find it isn't useful for me to go down the list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. However, if I play around with these techniques from time to time, just every day, when I am confronted with a real-life situation in my work, the techniques are there and I use them without even thinking, just as I would use logical, inductive, or deductive reasoning. So I'll share with you the 5 techniques, and it's up to you to develop your techniques and practice them so they become second nature to you. The first technique of lateral thinking is setting an arbitrary quota for yourself. If you have a problem that you want to solve, and you think that there are perhaps 3 or 4 ways of analyzing it or solving it, set yourself a quota of coming up with 10 solutions. Now that may seem totally unreasonable and perhaps impossible, but by setting a quota for yourself, you are going to stretch yourself to your limits. And whereas under your old system, you would come up with your 3 or 4 solutions, and then decide which of the 3 or 4 I like the best, you are going to force yourself to come up with 10 solutions. If you write them down, then you'll look at the list, and you might find that 8th or 9th solution might be
one you're looking for.
Right. It might be an extremely useful one, and you might not have taken the time or the tenacity to come to that solution. So the first technique, setting a quota, I find to be the most useful for me, but it takes time and a lot of self-discipline. The second technique, which I find very useful, is evaluation and suspending judgment. Now, this is very hard to do in a normal business context because people are constantly on their toes, constantly trying to do an excellent job and show the people they're working with that they're doing an excellent job. But if you can evaluate and suspend judgment of any particular solution or proposed solution that comes along, rather than immediately accepting or rejecting it, you will find that not only will you perhaps analyze it all the better, but you might come to a completely different solution, perhaps even related, that is even better.
Can you give us an example of a person who might have some difficulty suspending judgment and how that person would develop that capacity?
Well, I, for example, working with superiors all the time, I'm confronted with the problem of proposing something which I think makes sense, a solution to a business problem, and they're immediately rejecting it without evaluating and suspending judgment.
Yes.
Now, what I would recommend in that situation, in order that both my superior and I be able to evaluate and suspend judgment, is to set some ground rules. And this is often done by establishing a brainstorming seminar or format, where you and your superior sit down, perhaps with other people, and it is agreed that for a finite period of time, 15 or 20 minutes, there will be no put-downs and no rejection of any ideas, and that the people participating actually generate as many ideas as they can come up with, and at the end of the session, then the evaluation takes place.
There is no evaluation during this process.
That's right. That's right. You have to, in order to participate in a brainstorming technique, you have to risk being wrong. And this has to be explained to everybody who participates, that the purpose of the session is not to come up with the best idea in as early in the session as possible, but rather to come up with as many ideas, even wrong ideas, even bad ideas. And possibly by coming up with these bad ideas will generate the environment where you can generate good ideas. The third technique that I talk about for lateral thinking is called analogy. Now this really draws upon every ounce of creativity that we have. It goes back to very early techniques we had as children. to find comparable stories or situations or things that just seem similar in some way to what our initial problem is. Now, the way I speak to adults and tell them how they might use the analogy technique is to combine it with the quota. Say, I am going to find 10 analogies or 8 analogies or X analogies to my present problem, and by looking at these analogies I might be able to generate some unusual solutions to my problem.
Can you give us an example, please, Nancy?
Well, one way that we talk about in our negotiating seminar is analogizing the behavior of the obstinate negotiator on the other side to something. Now, say I'm negotiating with a gentleman on a business contract, and he has just given me a last and final offer.
Yes.
And he's told me this is the best he's going to do. He doesn't want to talk to me anymore. He doesn't want to waste anybody's time. His last and final offer is just uttered. I either accept it or reject it. Now, I'm in a quandary. How do I deal with this man? By using the analogy technique and setting quota, if I sit down and I say, this man reminds me of, and then I list the 8 things or people or animals or objects he reminds me of, by listing those things I might come up with a solution on how to deal with him. For example, one thing he might remind me of is a child.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think, how would I deal
with that child?
That's right. Okay, but I'm not going to stop with that first analogy, am I? I'm going to go on to my other 7. Another thing I might think that he reminds me of is an ostrich. Right? And now the ostrich leads me to believe that perhaps by doing an end run on him or enticing him out of his hole, I might be able to get him to talk to me some more. Another analogy is a third strike in a ball game. You know, what does that analogy lead me to? Well, perhaps that this inning is over, but not the ball game.
Ah, okay.
Another analogy is a closed door. This man has just given me a closed door. How do I find the key? I can go on to name 8 analogies, but as you can see, the analogy technique is limited only by one's imagination. I set no rules for myself when I use the analogy, and as a result, I might come up with a very inventive solution. And the 4th technique I use for lateral thinking is working backwards. Now, working backwards, I find it's very hard to do, but when I see it's worked in many situations, I keep reminding myself about it, and I know sooner or later I'm going to use it. I'll give you an example of how working backwards can work. The problem I'm going to give to you, I'll let you think about it, and then my experience is people can never solve it, and then I'll explain how you solve it by working backwards. You are organizing a tennis tournament for your company. There are 125 people who want to enter this tennis tournament. It'll be singles tennis, 1 elimination, and the people will go up the tennis tournament ladder until finally you have 1 winner. All right, there are 125 entrants. I want to know how many tennis matches there will be before you have a 1 winner.
126?
No.
Close?
You are close, though. You are close. You'd be surprised at how many people give me extremely different answers to this when we teach our seminar. There are, we have people who have it, who divide 125 in 2. We have people who divide it by all sorts of strange numbers, multiply and divide incredibly. But if you work backwards, you can get the answer very simply, and I'll explain why. Most people who want to solve this problem think about the winners.
Yes.
All right? And they're thinking, well, there are 125 entrants, and how many there's 1 winner at the end, but how many winners in between, and they get all confused. Well, if you work backwards and concentrate on the losers, you get your solution very fast.
Tell me how, Nancy.
The way you do it is you think, if I have 125 entrants and 1 person is a winner all the way through, there's going to be 124 people who lose at least once.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the answer to the question. There are 124 matches. Now, working backwards is an illustration of sometimes the fastest way up the mountain is by standing on the top of the mountain and looking down. And sometimes the best way to solve a problem is not by thinking of where you are, but where you want to be. Think about your goal and how do you work back from your goal to where you are. For example, a sales manager who wants to reach a certain sales goal for a period of time gives an incentive to the salesman. If they each sell their fraction that he considers to be they're suitable to reach his total goal, they will get a gold Cadillac. He works backwards. He wants to reach the total sales goal, and therefore by encouraging each of his salesmen to give him that fraction of it, he will reach the full goal. Like I say, working backwards is hard to apply because you don't know when it's going to be useful and when it's not. But if you think that it's always a possibility, it might just come up and it might prove to be useful. The fifth technique that I use for lateral thinking ed is called random stimulation. And this is the most freewheeling of all the techniques. And this is what I use when all else fails. Random stimulation means you take a piece of totally unrelated information, and that information can be derived from anywhere. By looking out the window and seeing an object, by opening up a dictionary on a random page and putting your finger in a random spot, by talking to somebody on a personal subject and coming up with some event or subject that's irrelevant to your issue at hand. And by using that random word or object and freely associating, and also thinking about your problem. Perhaps if you think about a problem that you have right now in your work, perhaps, let's say I am negotiating for a raise with people I work for, and I don't know really, I think I've exhausted all my creative thinking. I'll go to the dictionary and I'll run my finger down a random page and I'll come up with the word flower.
Mm-hmm.
Now I start freely associating, and I think flower, sweet, pretty, gentle, lovely. Maybe that might give me some ideas. Maybe I've been too harsh with the people I'm negotiating with. And perhaps if I use the word flower to give me some new ideas about how to deal with them, it might give me some ideas.
Fascinating, Nancy. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
I hope it has some use to you.
Okay. What are some of the obstacles to lateral thinking? I think you've mentioned a few of them, but it would seem to me that one major obstacle was the matter of trust in dealing with people.
That's right.
Without the right climate in dealing with people, there's the tendency to get very defensive and really block any attempt at creative or problem-solving behavior.
That's right. I would say that lateral thinking can only be done in a safe environment because of two reasons. Number one, it's low probability. You're not going to get your results as high probability as you would under other analysis. And number two, we haven't been trained to use lateral thinking. It's a very discouraged technique of thinking in our society, and people who observe you doing this, if they don't understand, may put you down. And therefore, if you wish to use some of these techniques we've talked about, it's very important that you do it in a safe environment, either by yourself or with people who you've prepared for the technique and understand that it is a low probability kind of thought process. Low probability, but extremely valuable when you hit pay dirt. Another risk that I found is arrogance. You find some people feel that the old tried and true methods are the best, and that any of these newfangled methods for analyzing or coming up with new ideas are worthless. But it's the arrogance which people found literally through the ages, which has inhibited and stood in the way of a lot of very useful developments. And it's the unusual, freewheeling, outlandish thinkers who have gotten a lot farther. So if that's any consolation to people perhaps who are confronted with an arrogant environment, it is the creative solution that survives. Now, I know we're all concerned about progressing and doing an exceptional job in whatever we do. And it's these creative ideas that make us stand out from the rest, because there are a multitude of people who can use the tried and true methods, but it's a rare few who can really come up with the inventive, creative ideas.